In World War II, the Germans built some of the most feared weapons on Earth. Precision-engineered machine guns, high rate of fire systems, tanks and aircraft that dominated entire battlefields. And yet, there was one American weapon they never truly had an answer for. A machine gun so powerful that it blurred the line between infantry weapon and artillery. A weapon capable of destroying aircraft, tearing through vehicles, and punching straight through fortified positions. A weapon that would go on to set a sniper record that remained unbroken for 35 years. And perhaps the most astonishing part of all, it is still in service today. Not just in small numbers, but across more than 100 countries. And in many cases, it is still almost identical to the one first designed over a century ago. This is the story of the M2 Browning. To understand why this weapon became so dominant, we need to go back to a time when warfare itself was changing. The First World War introduced machine guns on a scale the world had never seen before. Entire battlefields were shaped by their firepower. Infantry advances were stopped in seconds. Defensive lines became nearly impossible to break. But despite their effectiveness, these early machine guns shared a critical limitation. They all fired the same cartridges as standard infantry rifles. At first, that was enough. They were designed to fight soldiers, and against soldiers they worked. But the battlefield did not remain static. Armored vehicles began to appear. Aircraft started receiving protective plating, and suddenly, rifle-caliber ammunition was no longer sufficient. Bullets that once cut through enemy positions now struggled to penetrate even light armor. And as technology advanced, that problem was only going to get worse. It became clear that a new type of weapon was needed, something more powerful, something capable of dealing with not just infantry, but the emerging threats of modern warfare. So in 1917, the United States Army issued a request. They wanted a machine gun capable of destroying both aircraft and armored vehicles. The requirements were ambitious: a caliber of at least half an inch, a muzzle velocity exceeding 2,700 feet per second. At the time, this was beyond anything in service. And the task was given to one man, John Browning. John Browning did not begin from scratch. Instead, he started with something already proven: his M1917 machine gun, a water-cooled 30 caliber weapon known for reliability and endurance under sustained fire. Rather than reinvent the system entirely, Browning scaled it up. Every component was reinforced. The structure was strengthened. And most importantly, it was adapted to fire a far more powerful cartridge. That cartridge would become the 50 BMG, a round designed to deliver unprecedented levels of energy on impact. It was partially inspired by a German anti-tank round, which had already demonstrated the effectiveness of larger calibers. But designing a cartridge is only part of the challenge. Building a machine gun capable of firing it reliably was something else entirely. The first trials began shortly after the end of World War I, and the results were far from encouraging. The weapon was heavy, difficult to control, and impractical for most battlefield roles. The early production version, known as the M1921, attempted to address these issues, but new problems quickly appeared. The water-cooled version weighed over 120 pounds. The air-cooled version was lighter but still extremely heavy. With its tripod, the complete system could weigh up to 170 pounds, and that was before adding ammunition. Infantry units could not realistically deploy it in mobile operations. At the same time, the air-cooled barrel overheated rapidly. Recoil made accurate fire difficult. Aircraft could not easily carry it due to weight, and early armored vehicles struggled with its limited feeding configuration. For a time, the weapon seemed like a failure, an ambitious concept without a clear practical application. Then, in 1926, John Browning died. The project remained incomplete, but his team continued the work. and what followed would transform the weapon into one of the most effective systems ever created. The breakthrough came through a series of critical design improvements. The first was modularity. Engineers developed a single receiver that could be adapted into multiple configurations. By changing barrels, jackets, and components, the same machine gun could serve in different roles: ground combat, aircraft use, anti-aircraft defense, all from the same base system. Ammunition feeding was also redesigned. The weapon could now feed from either the left or the right side. This allowed it to be mounted more easily on different platforms. The second major improvement addressed overheating. A heavy barrel design was introduced. This allowed the weapon to sustain fire for longer periods without overheating. This version became known as the M2HB heavy barrel, and it would define the weapon's legacy. Now the machine gun performed as intended. It fired between 450 and 575 rounds per minute, with an effective range exceeding 2,000 yards. The power of the 50 BMG round was unlike anything else on the battlefield. It delivered up to 15,000 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle, several times greater than standard rifle cartridges. At close range, it could penetrate nearly an inch of hardened steel. Walls, bunkers, and light armored vehicles offered little protection. On the battlefield, it filled a critical role, bridging the gap between infantry weapons and artillery. By World War II, production had scaled massively. Nearly 2 million units were produced, and they were deployed everywhere: on tanks, on aircraft, on ships, on ground vehicles. If a platform could carry a weapon, it carried the M2. The true strength of the M2 Browning was not just its power, it was its versatility. In the air, aircraft-mounted versions fired at significantly higher rates, allowing pilots to deliver intense bursts of fire in very short time windows. Fighters like the P-51 Mustang and F-6F Hellcat carried multiple M2 machine guns, creating devastating streams of fire during combat engagements. Bombers used them defensively, protecting against enemy fighters attempting interception. On the ground, the weapon was just as effective. It could destroy light armored vehicles, break through fortifications, and suppress large areas with sustained fire. One of the most feared configurations was the quad mount. 4 M2 machine guns combined into a single system. This system could track targets rapidly and deliver overwhelming firepower. Against both aircraft and ground forces, German forces had highly effective machine guns. The MG-34 and MG-42 were among the best of their time, but they were limited by their ammunition. Rifle caliber rounds could not match the range or power of the 50 BMG. Even when German forces captured M2 machine guns, they could not replicate them at scale, because by that stage of the war, it was too late. What truly set the M2 Browning apart was not just its raw power, but how that power translated across every battlefield role imaginable. Unlike most weapons of its time, it was never limited to a single purpose. It was not just an anti-aircraft gun. It was not just a vehicle-mounted weapon. It was not just a heavy support gun. It was all of those things at the same time. On the ground, it gave infantry and armored units something they had never really had before: a weapon capable of reaching out far beyond the range of enemy machine guns and doing meaningful damage at those distances. While most machine guns began losing effectiveness at longer ranges, the 50 BMG round retained enormous energy even beyond 2,000 yards. That meant American forces could engage targets that the enemy simply could not reach effectively in return. This created a psychological effect as much as a physical one. Enemy troops were forced to take cover earlier, stay hidden longer, and move more cautiously. Because once the M2 opened fire, there were very few safe places to hide. Walls could be penetrated. Sandbag positions could be torn apart with sustained fire. Light vehicles could be disabled quickly. Even armored targets were vulnerable from certain angles. and this level of dominance changed how engagements were fought. It allowed American units to control space in a way that smaller caliber weapons simply could not achieve. In the air, the effect was even more dramatic. Aircraft equipped with multiple M2 machine guns could concentrate an incredible amount of firepower into a very short window of time. During a strafing run, a pilot might only have a second or two to fire before passing the target. In that brief moment, the ability to put as many rounds as possible into the air was critical. That is why aircraft often carried multiple M2s, 6, 8, or even more in some configurations. When those guns fired together, the result was not just a stream of bullets, but a concentrated wall of fire. And because each round carried so much energy, even short bursts could be devastating. Engines could be disabled, structures could be destroyed, armored vehicles could be damaged or disabled. The combination of rate of fire and raw power made the M2 uniquely effective in this role. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the M2 Browning is not what it did in World War II. It is what happened after. Most weapons designed during that era were eventually replaced. New technologies emerged, new doctrines developed, and older systems faded out of service. But the M2 did not. It continued into Korea, then Vietnam, then the conflicts of the late 20th century, and into modern warfare in Iraq and Afghanistan. Decade after decade, it remained relevant, not because it was never improved, but because its original design was so fundamentally sound that it did not need to be replaced. Even modern upgrades did not change the core of the weapon. They improved usability, they improved safety, but they did not change what made it effective. That is something very few weapons in history can claim. In the end, the M2 Browning represents something rare in military design. A weapon that arrived at exactly the right balance of power, reliability, and adaptability. It was powerful enough to remain relevant, simple enough to remain reliable, and flexible enough to be used in almost any role. That is why, more than 100 years later, it is still here, still in use, still doing exactly what it was designed to do. After World War II, the M2 did not disappear. It continued to serve in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. In Vietnam, it was even adapted into a sniper platform. Carlos Hathcock used it to achieve a record kill at over 2,500 yards. Modern upgrades improved safety and usability. Remote weapon systems allowed operators to fire from protected positions. New barrel designs simplified operation, and yet the core design remained unchanged. A weapon over 100 years old, still in active service, still relevant. So what do you think? Is the M2 Browning the greatest machine gun ever created, or simply a design so effective that nothing has replaced it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more cinematic military documentaries like this, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for the next episode.